Welcome everyone and good morning. I'm Grace Kang, Structural Engineer and Director of Communications at PEER. We are about to share a multi-year, multidisciplinary research project coordinated by PEER and conducted by a large team led by Principal Investigator Yousef Bozorgnia. The project title is Quantifying the Performance of Retrofit of Cripple Walls and Sill Anchorage in Single-Family Wood Frame Buildings, or the CEA PEER project, or the PEER CEA project. This project exemplifies the performance-based engineering approach developed at PEER over 20 years ago, and since has been adopted by so many of our research and practitioner colleagues today. This approach looks at a large, multifaceted question and enables researchers to deeply explore different components of the problem and then collaborate and coordinate to develop meaningful results. So as the project coordinator, I'm pleased to moderate the sessions that will provide information about this project. To our attendees, please do submit your question in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll address them at the end of each overall time session. So at this point, I would like to hand it over to Yousef Bozorgnia, professor at UCLA and the project principal investigator, who will get us started with the project overview.
Great, thank you very much. Now, Erin, how do I control this?
I think you can click, there you go.
Okay, very good. Can you hear me, Grace, everyone?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much and good morning. As Grace mentioned, Grace and I will give a short overview of the project, and then the rest of today and a good portion of tomorrow, you will hear more details of the project. So before we start, we really appreciate the support of CEA and CEA management and staff, not only financial support, but to tell you the truth, more importantly, encouragement. During large projects, there are lots of things that you need support of the sponsor, and we receive that. We appreciate that. Then the project had two advisory panels, one of them internal to the project and the other one by CEA. Overall, I think there were 8 people involved in these two advisory panels. We received lots of comments from them, and we really appreciate their efforts. Small comments as well as large comments, editorial comments as well as very important substantial comments, and we appreciate all their comments. This project, as you see in a minute, involves a huge amount of people, large community-based project, including researchers and practicing professionals, and that is really the strength of that. We relied both on the practicing professionals as well as researchers to provide something that is defensible at the end. The objective of the project in a simple way is that if you have a deficient single family home in terms of crawl space and cripple wall, if you retrofit that, how much is really you're reducing the damage to your building. In other words, if we get a little bit more scientifically, what is the fragility modification factor or damage modification function? You retrofit your deficient single family home in terms of cripple wall, really what do you gain after the earthquake in terms of damage? The project involved, as you see it today and tomorrow, major numerical modeling and simulations by various groups, but it was led by Stanford colleagues, and lots of experimental testings at different places to validate the simulation results, which I'm going to say a few words, and then you are going to hear later today also about it. This is the org chart of the project. You don't have to read it. The only issue really that I want to emphasize is that many people were involved, both at the junior level researcher, senior level researcher, as well as practitioners. Before I move on, there was a key member of our team, Professor Steve Main, that we started with him, and unfortunately we lost him. He passed away during the proposal preparations as well as interview and so on. Steve was always there, always supportive with many, many great ideas. We miss him. So the project started after we were awarded. It took a little bit of time to get the contract in place by University of California and CEA. Officially started on October 17, 2016, and it will be done literally in a couple of weeks. The project consists of 7 working groups or 7 major tasks that I'm going to mention briefly about it. Working group 1 was a literature review. We started early on, and then gradually that was merged or dissolved into other working groups, because each working group has had its own extensive literature review as part of their work. Then there was a working group on index buildings, because there are so many variations of their triple wall height, as well as the other characteristics, 1-story, 2-story, and so on. So we needed a focused working group to come up with a manageable short list of the buildings that we need to address. Then the working group 3 was dealing with the ground motion selection and scaling and loading protocol. You're going to hear from these working groups 3.1, 3.2 later this afternoon. Experimental investigations were comprehensive, and you are going to hear again this afternoon about their activity. Analytical modeling and simulation also was extremely comprehensive, and you are going to hear about that working group mainly tomorrow. Working group 6 was interaction with the claim adjusters and modelers, loss modelers, very interesting findings. And finally, reporting. And after Grace and I are done, basically we jump to really reporting. We want to show you the results, findings of our project, followed by in the afternoon and tomorrow by details. So you're going to see the head line of the project later, really after in few minutes. I'm going to show you only 2-3 slides to just give you a flavor of what we have been doing in terms of tasks. I'm not going to review everything because you're going to hear back today and tomorrow. So I'm not going to go over the details. We have had extensive experimental activities both at UC San Diego, led by Professor Hutchinson, and at UC Berkeley. Kelly Coben was in charge of experimental work at UC Berkeley. At San Diego, they did lots of specimens at a smaller scale. At Berkeley, they did larger specimens. This is just, again, you don't have to read the whole thing. I want to give you a big picture overview. They did lots of testings at San Diego, 20 cripple wall, retrofitted, unretrofitted, various boundary conditions. And this is just one example. There are tens of the examples like this. Hysteretic loop, engineers love to see hysteretic loop. Vertical axis is lateral force, horizontal axis is drift. The red curves are the results of retrofitted specimen. The blue curve is result of unretrofitted, and obviously the capacity of retrofitted specimen was much larger. In summary, retrofit works. So the same thing for larger specimen at UC Berkeley. This is what you see, the one of the specimens. Just to see the size of that, you can see postdoctoral fellow Dave Walsh, who is behind the opening of the specimen. At Berkeley, also, they have lots of hysteretic loop. Again, this is only one example that you see what is going on in a big picture. Again, you see the retrofitted case has larger capacity, much larger capacity than unretrofitted existing case. Analytical modeling, extensive analytical modeling led by Stanford colleagues, and they are going to elaborate tomorrow especially. So they started with the buildings, 1 story, 2 story, the different heights of the cripple wall and so on. They made the open seas model, then they subjected the models to a lot of ground motions. They developed the fragility functions, then retrofitted and unretrofitted. Lots of analysis they carried out, over 100,000 nonlinear dynamic analysis they carried out. If they wanted to do the analysis on single computer, single CPU, it would take about 4 years to run. Obviously, they use high performance computing and they ran the whole analysis in about 4.5 weeks. And again, you're going to hear from them. The bottom line that you're going to hear after Grace and I are done, as well as tomorrow, is that the loss, if you don't do anything about your cripple wall deficient single family home, the expected loss is much, much more than obviously if you do retrofit. You are going to hear more and you are going to see more details today and tomorrow. So in summary, we are at really the final stage of the project. It's all about documentation now. We already drafted the first batch of reports. Grace is going to show you the how many reports and so on are prepared. We went through the first cycle of the review. Now we are finalizing the reports. It was a major multidisciplinary applied research. And many people were involved, which is the good thing. We get the really expertise from academia as well as practicing community, and that is really the strength of the project. The project results, as Janelle mentioned in the morning, will be used by CEA and insurance industry to take it to the next level, which is really the effects on rates and financial and so on, which is really outside our scope. And the project also, we believe, has created a platform for future research. All the data are saved, archived, and will be made available to the public and researchers and community. And I'm sure more research ideas and follow-up research will continue. Thank you very much, everyone. I stop here. Now Grace Kang is going to continue, and then we'll go to the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, it helps if I unmute myself. Thank you, Yousef. Okay, I'm going to have a trigger finger here, I'm afraid. One of the benefits of this project is that there is a mechanism for the research and methods to be shared with the interested community, the practitioner community, as well as the research community. There are in progress 13 peer technical reports led off by a technical summary report, which will outline the project summary, and then 12 other technical reports, which will provide details of process and findings from each of the working groups that Yousef has described earlier. There is a dedicated web page archiving the reports and the project data. This is available to the public. It will contain data that includes the experimental testing data, images and videos. We had a workshop with claims adjusters to help us understand and get estimates of repair costs data for that will be included. And then for the computational modeling, the input and output files of the OpenSeas models are also posted up on this website. The website URL is at the bottom of the screen. And let's see. Okay, so Erin, I'm having problems controlling this. If you could advance it for me, I would appreciate it. I'm not sure why this is not happening. One more, there you go. Okay, so one back, please. So this data will be posted to the web page after the project completion, which is scheduled in just a few weeks. So, so that's where the data is going to reside. Notification of the peer reports can be found at the peer website, which is peer.berkeley.edu, or you can be notified by email by subscribing to the peer newsletter. And there are buttons on the peer website so that you can subscribe to the peer news digest. So let's see. I am not able to advance. Okay, today you will hear summaries of the project from our key working group leaders. We will end this morning's session with key findings from Evan Reis, structural engineer, and then the key findings that are especially targeted to the lay audience will be presented by Sharyl Rabinovici of Sharyl Rabinovici Consulting. And so she will summarize what's called a stakeholder report. After lunch, we'll dive deeper into the technical aspects of the loading protocol selection presented by Farzin Zerain, who's Associate Professor of Engineering at UC Irvine. And this loading protocol was developed for the experimental testing program. This testing program, which, as Yousef said, was conducted at UC San Diego and UC Berkeley, will be described in more detail with the various construction materials of the specimens and test results. So the quantified data of the behavior of unretrofitted and retrofitted specimens will be presented by Tara Hutchinson, professor at UC San Diego, and Kelly Cobean, structural engineer and associate principal at West Jenny Elsener Consultants. This testing data was critical to validate the analytical modeling and analysis efforts that we will hear about more tomorrow. And then Silvia Mazzoni, who's project scientist at UCLA, will outline the seismic hazard ground motion selection process, focusing on 4 sites within California, which were used for our project. So the ground motion selection process and the scaling process did also feed the efforts of the modeling and analysis group, which once again, we will hear more about tomorrow. Tomorrow, we will hear from Brett Lazundia, who's a structural engineer and principal at Rutherford and Shakeen, about the efforts for a workshop with claims adjusters. This workshop was designed to gather estimates of repair costs. And then the computer modeling and analysis process used to develop damage functions for the unretrofitted and retrofitted crawl space construction will be presented by Dave Welch, who's a postdoc researcher at Stanford University, and also be presented by Greg Dearline, professor at Stanford University. And then we'll hear from Evan Reis, again, who will talk about the comparison between the results from this project's analytical models and results with respect to industry catastrophe models. So as is typical in research, our project team discussed many options and paths to pursue during the life of the project. But we needed to focus on the project deliverables with a limited time and budget. So tomorrow, Yousef and I will present some future research topics that arose from our project team's discussion as we focused on this specific cripple wall project. At this point, I'd like Evan Reis, structural engineer, and Sharyl Rabinovici of Sharyl Rabinovici Consulting to present the key findings of the peer CEA report, peer CEA project. I'd like to remind you to please submit your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will address them at the end of this session. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you, Grace and Yousef. My name is Reis. I'm a structural engineer here in the Bay Area. And my contribution to the project was primarily to focus on the sort of conversion, the understanding of the types of buildings that were relevant in California, cripple wall homes for the project, looking at the vulnerability functions that were developed, which I'll explain in a little bit, and then this interaction with industry catastrophe modelers. So what I'm going to do today is present some of the key findings of the project. It's not going to go into too much detail. Tomorrow, I'll go into more detail about the work with the industry modelers. So let's see. Okay, so I'm trying to advance my screen, Aaron. There we go. Okay. Okay, so key project findings. Well, there were two primary objectives to this project. Really, there was one overarching objective, and that was the first one, and Yousef's mentioned this, and that is to quantify the benefits of retrofitting cripple wall homes, older cripple wall homes that didn't include plywood sheathing between the foundation and the first floor, using the ATC 110, which became FEMA P1100 retrofit procedures that Kelly spoke to you about earlier. So we wanted to quantify how much that retrofit, based on a range of housing styles, how much that reduced repair costs, basically. That's actually the overarching goal of the project. But in order to eventually have an impact on insurance rates, which really is, of course, one of the goals of CEA, is to provide meaningful incentives for folks to retrofit their homes. We also needed to calibrate to the way the industry calculates potential damage and losses to these buildings. And so the second key objective here was to compare the benefits that the project developed through its analytical and testing process to the way the insurance modelers see vulnerability of these types of houses. Okay, and again, tomorrow I will speak more to the second one, although I'll talk about some of the key findings today. So let's start with the benefit of retrofit. So as Yousef mentioned, there were 7 working groups working very hard on this project throughout the full 4 years of the project. And so just a quick sort of flow chart of how that worked. We wanted to make sure that we were using the latest science that was out there, but we were also taking advantage of the many studies that have been done over time about the performance of single-family homes. So we began the whole project with a search on what's out there. What tests have been done? What studies have been done? What kind of empirical data and testing data was available? We didn't want to duplicate anything that we thought was good, but we also wanted to fill in gaps or improve, what we thought might be obsolete or missing. The second item was to develop this a set of index buildings, and I'll talk about that actually in a little bit more detail in a couple slides. We had to understand what the different combinations of housing styles, single-family housing styles, were prevalent in California. I mean, you can walk down most streets or cities and see, literally hundreds of different types of houses. And so we had to try and narrow down the types of houses, the key parameters in a house that affected its seismic performance. Then, and you'll hear more about this after Sharyl and I speak. Working Group 3 worked on the loading protocols and the development of the ground motion for both the testing component and for the analytical modeling component. We looked at a number of sites around California to look at the different ground motion behavior, because of course CEA, wants to be accessible to all folks throughout the state. Those loading protocols were used, as Yousef mentioned, in the testing program, which was a fascinating effort, and Tara and Kelly will blow you away with all the amazing stuff that they and Brandon Schiller did as part of this project. All of this was here to get us to the point where we could actually start building models of the building. And Greg Deerline and Dave Welch will talk tomorrow about how they took past research plus the testing information and the ground motion information to create a model of these buildings that estimated their damage, okay, as a function of ground motion. So that was working group 5. Working group 6 was divided into several different parts, if you will. A very interesting part, and Brett Lazundia will talk about this tomorrow, is we wanted to get even better information on damage than what was sort of in the industry now. A lot of what is in the industry now might be older empirical data or data from estimates from engineers. But we wanted to sort of go right to the horse's mouth, if you get my drift, and meet with claims adjusters, those folks that work for the insurance company that are going to be the ones that really quantify how much they're going to give you to repair the building, right? And so Brett will talk about the whole effort that he and his colleagues went through to develop this improved damage information with the help of these adjusters. And then with all that, with the loss model, or with the analytical modeling and the information from the claims adjusters, these loss models were developed. So this ultimately is the main deliverable to CEA, which is, if you have an existing house of this configuration, what are its likely damage and loss characteristics in an earthquake? And then what do you get if you improve that, right? And then finally, working group 6, as I mentioned, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow, did a comparison with the industry catastrophe modelers for their estimates of, if you have a house of this height and this type of material, what is its loss? What is its loss if it's retrofitted? Okay, so let's jump into, the development of the index buildings. This was an important consideration. This took us quite a while in the beginning of the project. And again, as I said, there are, you can go around, you can see hundreds and hundreds of different types of houses, but we couldn't simply model, every possible combination of homes. So as part of this study, we wanted to focus on what was manageable for the project team. First and foremost, we have to talk about houses that are characteristic to California, right? CEA is a California Earthquake Authority, so there's a lot of construction of brick houses in other parts of the country. We don't really construct brick houses here. So we wanted to identify those characteristics of homes that were common in California, right? Because those are the kinds of homes for which these retrofits, these brace and bolt retrofits, would be used. But we also understand that if the overriding goal of this effort is to help insurers calculate risk and premiums based on, the characteristics of the home, these characteristics had to be sort of readily available. When you have an underwriter, sometimes an underwriter doesn't even come to your house to give you a quote. But if an underwriter comes to your house, there's only a few things that they're going to look at. They're going to look at the outside configuration. They'll go inside the house and possibly look at the walls. But they're not going to open up anything. They're not going to be able to see what's under the drywall or the plaster or the stucco. Some of them won't even go under the house, really. And so we had to make sure that the characteristics that we were really modeling, either we had a good approximation of what they would be if it was not readily visible, or it had to be something that was determinable by somebody like an underwriter. And then, as brought up early in the today, there are a lot of things that can affect the performance of a house, right? Chimneys, living space over garages, really heavily sloped sites, and of course, cripple walls. The focus of this project was on the cripple wall. And so we really wanted to make sure that we excluded sort of extraneous characteristic of the house where the difference in performance between a retrofitted and an unretrofitted cripple wall didn't change based on that characteristic. So, we had to sort of control ourselves and limit ourselves to the project at hand. You will hear tomorrow a number of other future researches, which we hope will, be funded to look at the other types of vulnerable aspects of homes. Specifically, slab on grade homes were excluded. Those were more common in the 70s and up until today. Those houses have no cripple wall, and it's difficult because there's no crawl space to see if the house is bolted, to the slab. So that was excluded, and the living space over garage was specifically excluded. I wanted to note that because that's sort of it's a major issue that a lot of people think about. It certainly will have an impact on the performance of the home, and we hope that'll be left for another day. We felt that including that as a characteristic made the analytical modeling that much more difficult because of the nonlinear performance of those kinds of elements. Okay, so we ultimately came up with a list of building variants, we call them. These were the characteristics of the building in different categories that we would then combine to create this list of index buildings. The most important are probably the first three. The age of the house. The age of the house really defines some of the main styles of construction in California. Pre-World War II, houses were built with plaster. It wasn't always clear whether the houses were bolted to the foundation, and sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. But it really was characterized by that sort of heavier style of plaster framing. On the outside, you could still have wood siding or stucco. In the 1945 to 55 era, we started transitioning from plaster to drywall, right, after the war. So you had houses with both, basically. And then after 1955, we primarily used drywall in standard housing construction. Okay. Plus, you also had houses that were typically braced or bolted to the foundation. Although they could still have unbraced cripple walls. And then after 1970 or so, you started to use more plywood both on the outside of the house. And so you had plywood extending down from the first floor into the cripple wall and down to the foundation. And so that really is a house that is, at least nominally, braced, has a braced cripple wall. Exterior cladding, we focused on stucco and wood siding. There are other types of cladding for sure. There's brick siding. But again, we were focusing on where we had the most common types of construction in California. Same thing with heights. 1- and 2-story buildings, homes really comprise over 95% of the building stock in California, the single-family building stock. The seismicity, we did look at 4 different locations in developing this model, these models, from moderate to very high seismicity. We don't really have low seismicity in California, but we looked in Bakersfield at moderate hot seismicity, and then Northridge, San Francisco, and I'm blanking on the other one. It's here in a second. For the 4th site. And so we also examined soil type. It turns out that most of the soil types in California are Class D soil, so we stuck with that as a default soil type. And then we looked at other combinations of the homes. The cripple wall itself, varying heights of cripple wall, what we call a stem wall. This is a case where the concrete footing goes all the way up to the underside of the first story, and it still may be 18 or 24 inches or more above the grade level, so there still may be a crawl space, but there is no sort of wood wall, you know, between the foundation right at the ground and the first story. Okay, and then we looked a little bit at slope conditions as well, where you have a cripple wall that might be 2 feet tall on one side of the house and 4 feet tall on the other. We considered building mass, in particular when it came to the siding material. Wood siding is much lighter than stucco. Gypboard is much lighter than lath and plaster. And what we found is that the weight of the building had a very large impact on overall performance. And then finally, you know, something that we sort of attempted to quantify, although it was really more through the testing than it was a lot of specific research on this, is construction quality. Obviously, older homes are going to have more deterioration and that kind of thing. And it was something we could estimate, but we couldn't quantify specifically. Okay, so I have to credit Dave Walsh for all of the very cool looking icons of houses you will see throughout this project. We use these throughout to represent the different styles of homes: 1-story, 2-story, stucco cladding, wood cladding, an underlayment or a finish of lath and plaster. You see the sort of cutaway there on the house. Houses with cripple walls, which, as I said, are these wood, you know, the wood walls between the foundation and the first floor, and stem walls, where the concrete goes all the way up to the first floor. So you will see these various combinations. We have a retrofitted condition and an unretrofitted condition. And so thank Dave Walsh for that. Now, Yousef showed you this in the beginning during his talk. Let me just go into this in a little bit more detail. The key output of the project that will ultimately be used by the insurance industry are these things called vulnerability functions. Sometimes they're called damage functions. And they represent the amount of loss of earthquake repair costs incurred as a function of how severe the ground motion is, right? A bigger earthquake has larger ground motion. Larger ground motion leads to more damage, okay? And so you will see this graph on the left here, and again, using these icons, you've got existing homes and retrofitted homes. You've got wood siding and stucco siding, and you can see there's a big difference in the performance of buildings depending on the siding and certainly if they're retrofitted or not. For the same ground motion, for instance, 1G, here, 100% of gravity. In the unretrofitted case, the losses range from 30 to 50% of the replacement cost of the building. But in the retrofitted case, it's more like 6 or 7%. And so that obviously has a big impact on the performance, and then ultimately on, you know, what the insurance companies pay out, and so presumably an impact on the damage or on the premiums. And we have looked, and I'll describe this in more detail tomorrow. I won't go into it in too much detail now because it'll take time. But we wanted to look at both the loss in what we considered like the big one, a big event. So we took an event that occurs on average every 250 years at the different sites that we considered and said, well, what's the loss in that big one event? But we also wanted to annualize this. When you when you invest in the stock market or in a mutual fund, for example, you know, the Schwab will tell you what the annual return on investment is for that stock. And that means that if you hold the stock or the mutual fund for many years, on average, every year, it makes 3% or 5%. And that's the way insurance companies think about how they price policies, is on average for buildings like this, how much am I going to pay out every year? You know, even though obviously in many years there'll be no payout, and then in one year when there's an earthquake, there might be a big payout. So this expected annual loss is a way of sort of amortizing losses over time that is very useful for financial reasons. Okay, so let's get into some of the results. What you see here, and we have many of these figures, okay, and they're all accessible, as Grace said, in the various reports. So what you're seeing here are 4 different places where we located the buildings: Bakersfield, San Francisco, Northridge, and San Bernardino. And on the left, you see a group of pre-1945 houses, and on the right, a group of 1956 to 1970 houses. the 45 to 55 houses, the losses are essentially about the average of those. And what you see are different bars for the retrofitted condition, the solid bars, and I'm sorry, the unretrofitted condition, the existing condition, and the retrofitted bars, which is the hashed bars. And you can just see the sort of difference that we're getting in terms of losses based on whether the house is 1 or 2 stories, stucco or wood siding, and chipboard in the later years versus lath and plaster. And to give you, just to zoom in on one example, let's take these 3 locations of high seismicity: San Francisco, Northridge, and San Bernardino. You can see that for even just a 1-story home, unretrofitted, with a lath and plaster pre-1945, you're upwards and around 60% loss in the big one, this 250-year event, right? And so that means that, you know, an earthquake that large on average will cause a loss, a repair cost equal to about 60% of the price of the house, which is pretty significant. But if you retrofit it, that average is only about 13%. Right? So there's a huge difference there in the unretrofitted versus the retrofitted condition. And just, you can sort of just march along and look at those differences for these different styles of houses. Now, I didn't show Bakersfield here. That's the blue bar on the left. And you can see that, you know, Bakersfield is in the area of lower seismicity. There's still substantial loss to the house in an unretrofitted condition, and substantial reduction in that loss in the retrofitted condition as well. It goes from about 35% to about 4%. So to give you an idea of what this kind of savings is, if you have a 1-story home that costs about $240,000 to replace, 60% loss is $144,000, 13% loss is $31,000. So the savings on that style of home would be on the order of about $113,000 in that event. So that's obviously quite significant. The typical cost of a brace and bolt retrofit, and Sharyl will talk a little bit about this, is like $3,000 to $7,000 depending on where you live. And so if you're really trying to protect yourself against the big one, there's a high return on this, on that investment. And you can see that across the board, it is that way. 1-story house, well, I'll go into some of the key findings in a second. We also looked at the average annual loss. Again, this is sort of the amortized return you get sort of every year. Obviously, we don't have an earthquake every year, but if you hold the house for 30 or 50 years, on average, this is sort of the benefit you will get. For these same 3 houses in an unretrofitted condition, 1-story house with lath and plaster, older home, the average annual loss is about 1.5%. And for a 2-story home, or for a retrofitted condition, it's about 1/4%. And what does that mean? Well, if you have that same $240,000 house and you have 1.5% loss every year, that means averaged over the life of the home, you're having about $3,600 of loss per year in your unretrofitted home. And if you go down to 1/4%, that's only $600. So you can think of it as a savings, just like a return on your stock or your bond, or your mutual fund portfolio, of about $3,000 per year by retrofitting your home. Okay. And again, if the typical cost to retrofit a home is $3,000 to $7,000, then you can see, depending on where you live and depending on, you know, the style of your home, that return is achieved pretty quickly in just a short period of time, right? So these are the kinds of things that we noticed coming out of this project. So key findings, I'll go through these relatively quickly. Wood siding walls wood-sided cripple walls are more susceptible to damage than stucco-sided walls. Now, stucco is a heavier material and mass works against us in earthquakes, but stucco is also much stronger than typical wood siding. Wood siding typically is just horizontal boards placed directly against the studs, maybe with some, you know, some paper in between for weatherproofing. And those are very weak. There's not a lot of strength, lateral strength with horizontally sided wood siding. So what we saw is that the equivalent wood-sided house and stucco-sided house, the stucco one is going to perform much better. But once you retrofit by adding plywood, the plywood strength is much greater than than the horizontal sheathing or the stucco. And so once you retrofit the homes, you have relatively similar performance. We also found that 2-story homes do significantly worse than 1-story homes. This is not surprising, and it's because of the mass, right? You essentially have double the mass on what really ends up being, in an older home, the same cripple wall. Okay, it isn't as if they used 2 layers of wood sheathing in a 2-story home to make it twice as strong. So you essentially have twice the mass on the same strength cripple wall. So obviously they're going to perform quite a bit worse. So similarly, when you improve those houses by retrofitting them, the benefit is that much greater. We did find an interesting and significant difference between the older homes and the newer homes in terms of interior walls that have the finished material. Plaster on wood lath was sort of the norm before World War II, and it transitioned from 45 to 55 until it became, until drywall typically became the norm. Plaster is very heavy, so it does add mass, which again works against us, but it is also stronger, similar to stucco, right? I mean, it's a sort of a cementitious type of material almost, so it adds strength as well as mass. But in this case, we found that it's much more costly to repair plaster. It's more brittle than drywall, and so houses with plaster, all other things being equal, are going to perform worse than houses with drywall. Naturally, as you'd expect, the higher the seismicity, the higher the losses in an unretrofitted home, and of course, the bigger the benefit. Before we really started to do more engineering on homes, you didn't necessarily design a home that much differently in a place like Bakersfield than you would San Francisco in terms of how much structural sheathing you'd add again, or what the nailing pattern would be. So really, you kind of kept the capacity the same, but the demand just went up, right, as you get to higher seismicity. We did find a very big difference, and this again is not too surprising, between stem wall homes and cripple wall homes. The stem wall homes, again, remember the foundation, the concrete foundation comes all the way up to the underside of the first floor, whereas the cripple wall homes, you have that 2, 4, or 6 feet of wood unbraced wall. The houses perform very differently. The stem wall houses perform very well because there was no cripple wall to fail. The only failure mode was if the house started to slide off of its foundation because the bolting wasn't good enough. Whereas with the cripple wall homes, they rack over and they're very weak. And so similarly, you get less benefit for retrofitting a stem wall home where you need to add bolting and that's it basically, or maybe some clipping of the joist to the sill. Versus having the benefit you get by bracing a cripple wall. Okay. All right. So let me move into talking about the catastrophe modeler comparison. And again, I'm going to spend a lot more time on this tomorrow. So I'll just go into a little bit of it today. So the 3 biggest catastrophe modelers out there that work with the insurance industry are the AIR Worldwide, CoreLogic, which used to be EquiCat, and RMS. And all of them, I want to start by saying that I really we all appreciated on this project how helpful they were. We know that it's a challenge sometimes, because they have intellectual property, they compete with each other, but honestly, they were all more than generous with their time and with their positive comments and feedback about what we were doing. So I want to thank those folks. But the goal here was to compare the results that we got with similar types of houses that would be configured in these loss models. And we had to do it in a way that did protect their, their intellectual property, because obviously, Peer is publishing everything. And so, we wanted to respect the fact that there was that need to maintain some confidentiality. So we'll go into that tomorrow. I won't go into that today. A little bit about how we did that. But ultimately, we had to be able to match at least a subset of the buildings that we evaluated with a set of the buildings that the modelers would have. And by making that comparison, our goal was to increase the confidence of the modelers that the work we were doing was compatible with the way they approach loss modeling. So we ultimately chose 48 of the buildings to do a comparison. These were buildings where we could match our characteristic with the characteristic of all three of the modeling companies. We looked at 3 different age groups, which didn't line up precisely with all of the modelers. Each one has their own sort of little age group that might be a little different, but they were pretty close. The cladding style, stucco and wood, 1 and 2 story heights, cripple wall or stem wall condition, and then obviously the unretrofitted or retrofitted case. So let me give you some of the comparisons here. Again, I'll go into this in more detail tomorrow. The graph you see here in the next graph basically show 1-story homes and 2-story homes with wood and stucco, okay? These are all on raised foundations, so cripple walls, not a stem wall. The green bars represent the average of the 3 modelers' results, and the blue bars represent the CEA results. The solid bars are the unretrofitted case, and the hashed bars are the retrofitted case. So the first thing that should strike you is that the solid blue bars are much larger than the solid green bars. So what that means is in all cases, the peer CEA project predicted higher damage to buildings in the unretrofitted case than did the modelers on average. And so you can see for a 1-story raised foundation with wood, CEA peer is predicting closer to 50%, 48% damage, whereas the average of the modelers is under 20%. Okay, and that only gets more significant with the 2-story wood condition. But the second thing you'll notice is that the retrofit condition, excuse me, is actually, this is not the right slide. Yeah, I'd asked for this slide to be replaced, but it's close. What you're seeing here is that for the retrofitted condition, the modeler and the peers numbers are exactly the same, but they're not exactly the same. Jasmine, I'd asked for this slide to be replaced. What you see is there is a difference, but it's actually not very much. The difference in performance between the retrofitted conditions is much less, and I'll provide that slide tomorrow, an update of this slide tomorrow. But the key difference is you have a lot more damage in the unretrofitted condition, CEA peer compared to the loss modelers, and then you have much more similar damage in the retrofitted condition. So the same thing goes with average annual loss. All right. Again, this is sort of the amortized return, if you will, by looking at the loss over many years. This is what the insurance companies use. You can see again a very large difference between the loss, the blue bar, which is the peer CEA unretrofitted condition, and the green bar, which is the loss modeler unretrofitted condition. We're predicting a lot more damage because we're really finding, in particular in the wood houses, right? Because we're finding that the wood cripple walls really, really are weak, okay? The stucco cripple walls do much better, especially in the 1-story condition. And then again, not a lot of difference, some difference in the retrofitted case, but they compare much better. So key findings here with the comparisons with the catastrophe modelers. I think the most important one is that the catastrophe modelers consistently estimated lower damage for cripple wall homes, raised cripple wall homes. Okay, we compared a 2-foot cripple wall. We did look at other heights of cripple walls, but that wasn't easily comparable to the modelers because they just had a 1-term cripple wall or no cripple wall. So CEA, the peer CEA project is predicting significantly higher levels of damage for unretrofitted cripple wall conditions. We both predicted, the modelers and the project predicted larger damage for 2-story homes versus 1-story homes. And that, again, it has to do with the mass. But for us, we predicted a more significant difference in damage than the 1-story homes. Okay, that extra mass really makes a difference on your unbraced cripple walls. For the stem walls, on the other hand, it was sort of reversed. We found very little damage to houses, relatively speaking, when they had stem walls, because even if the house wasn't really well bolted to the foundation, you still typically had a condition where the sill plate was set into the wet concrete as the foundation was being poured, and that with maybe some spikes in there, if not bolts. And so you still actually had a very strong connection between the cripple wall, or excuse me, between the sill plate and the stem and the foundation wall. So the Pier CEA project predicted lower damage than what was shown in the modelers. That said, when we retrofitted the buildings, there was a much better comparison, especially for single-family homes, for 1-story homes. We found that the loss modelers and the Pier CEA project results were much more comparable, within 20–30% typically. An interesting thing that we have an explanation for, but it's something that can't always be well captured in the analytics, and sometimes you need the empirical data, and that is that the Pier CEA project showed consistent improvement with age. The worst performing buildings, because they typically had heavy lath and plaster, were the older pre-1945 buildings, plus they didn't have really good bolting of the foundation. As you went in the 1945 to 55 and you started transitioning to some drywall, the performance improved. And then when you got to 1955 to 1970 and you pretty much had all drywall, the conditions improved further. So we saw constant improvement with age. But interestingly, the modelers generally show a dip in performance between 1955 and 1970, and then a rise again. A dip in performance between 45 and 55, and then a rise in damage between 55 and 70. So the pre-45 houses are generally poor. They get better in 1945 to 55, but then they get worse again in 1955 to 70. And, I think one of the reasons for that may be just the way construction practices were going in the state, less union labor, after the war, after the mid 50s. And so there may have been things that empirically would come out in terms of damage results from insurance, but don't necessarily show up in our analytical models. And then finally, this is also pretty interesting. The modelers' results were pretty much uniform regardless of whether it was stucco or wood siding. They didn't show a lot of difference. Where the Pier project showed significantly better performance for stucco over wood in the unretrofitted condition, at least, and that's because stucco just has a lot of strength, and so when you're talking about that 2-foot unbraced cripple wall, having some sort of strength down there really does matter, and that was less evident in the insurance model results. So those are the key findings. I wanted to show one last slide, and this, good, I think I'm doing just right on time. One last slide, which is we also, as part of this project, did a very, pretty quick comparison with HAZUS. HAZUS is one of the sort of standard regional catastrophe, publicly available, let's say, catastrophe modeling software programs. And a lot of government officials use HAZUS to make estimates of regional damage. And so what we did is we compared the HAZUS damage functions to the damage functions we developed through this project. And the black lines, the black hash lines, sort of represent the range of possible HAZUS outcomes. Again, you got loss as a function of ground motion spectral acceleration. The red line represents a small amount of empirical data that was gathered through the Northridge earthquake from Wesson, and that actually compares quite well with the HAZUS data. And then the lines on top and bottom, of course, are our results, and you can just simply see that there's a much bigger range. they sort of bound the results. The upper bars, the dashed lines, represent unretrofitted conditions, unretrofitted conditions with cripple walls. And below the hashing, below the HASIS lines are solid lines, which represent retrofitted conditions, and dotted lines, which represent stem wall conditions. And so you can see that clearly in the unretrofitted condition, you have a lot more damage, and in the retrofitted or the stem wall condition, you have less damage. And it sort of bounds the results. So insofar as HASIS may want to update its own damage functions by separating out single family homes into more categories, they might be able to use this as a guide. So that's a quick review of the findings. I'll go into more detail on the loss modeler comparisons tomorrow. And now I'm going to turn it back to Aaron to give it over to Sharyl.
Hello, how's the sound going from Sharyl?
Good.
Hi. All right, someone's pulling up my slides, I presume. Aaron, do you have my slides ready to go? Okay, thank you. Let's go back one. Here. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon now, I guess. One aim of this project from the beginning was to create 2 final reports. One was focused on reaching a broader audience. So it's also a summary of the entire project, but one that's meant to translate the information, primarily the findings, not quite as much the methods, into a more accessible, shorter, absorbable length with more standard, plain use language and less depth, only at the depth that's necessary for these wider audiences. So what I'm going to be talking about in the next 15 minutes or so is the aims and the key messages as they're communicated in that report, which is 6 pages, not the 1,000 pages of documentation, and hopefully also a product, an output of this report that you will be able to use as you take the results of this study back to your own work. That report, the stakeholder findings report, is going to be available soon. It's under final review and formatting right now, so we anticipate that being available for you very soon. So as we all know, the audience for the findings of a research study is actually almost never only the scientists and the researchers who are experts in that field. And when CEA commissions research, it does so in part to answer questions that are critical to its own operations and sound government. So we have to consider that CEA has many uses for this study, including using it to communicate with less technical audiences. So that's a very important stakeholder, even though it's kind of internal to the project. A solid hope of the study is that the findings make their way into the understanding and the behavior of homeowners and real estate and insurance agents, who are the grassroots actors, if you will, who make retrofit and insurance decisions on the ground. And another way to influence grassroots participants in this policy world is to connect with their representatives. So people who work at the community scale, communicating about these risks, developing policies at an ordinance level or incentives, and then the people who are actually touching buildings, selling these retrofit projects, the practicing engineers and contractors. So it's really quite a wide group of people. Here's a look at the 6-page project summary. Obviously not meant for you to read the fine print here, but here's a glimpse of the product. And it's 6-page brochure-like format. It's more like a fact sheet, or what we would call in the public policy realm a research brief. The front page here is meant to stand alone, actually. It completely describes the project and its key findings and a quick summary of the methods and the research team and so on. It's still dense, but it's more colorful, more graphical, and the columns and the strong sectioning make for a faster read. And it still covers some of the technical ground. So it describes the methods of the project in a way that I wouldn't consider that's targeting the public, but it does contain messages in a form that could be further refined into educational, marketing, or media messages, as well as pointing to and supporting justifications for future research. So the first key message of the Peer CEA project is the reason for the project. Earthquakes can seriously damage single-family wood frame houses when they lack bracing and anchoring to the crawl space. What this study adds specifically is advanced information about how crawl space wall weaknesses lead to damage and at what cost. There are so many older houses in California that might have these weaknesses. We don't know how many, and we need to understand the consequences for the owners and what they can do about it. A final point is that the repair costs need to be understood in both the retrofit and unretrofit conditions, so we can see the savings that owners can benefit from if they invest in this kind of upgrade. The key message number 2 is that earthquake damage in a wood frame house can add up to tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And many homeowners cannot visually appreciate the many different aspects of their house that will be damaged. The Peer CEA project represents a big step forward in terms of documenting the costs of the many types of damage and how that damage might be different in houses with different features. In reality, it really all adds up. The Claims Adjuster Workshop, which will be discussed more tomorrow, provides some of the best and most up-to-date information to demonstrate the breakdown of repair costs among all these different elements and how claims adjusters make their estimates. We have started the process, I hope it's helpful to CEA, we're advancing the branding of the brace and bolt retrofit by calling this study the stakeholder report to brace and bolt benefit. Bracing and bolting a house is significantly reducing earthquake risk, often at important financial protection of what may be a homeowner's most important asset. Repair costs avoided was the sole study outcome. In other words, other benefits like improved safety, the ability to stay in one's home, to avoid temporary loss of use costs and other life disruption, those would be benefits not studied here, but on top of the brace and bolt benefits that we've been able to study and articulate. So how much can someone save in the quote unquote big one if they retrofit their house? Let's first look at the one-story houses again. And for this kind of prototypical generic stucco house, a brace and bolt retrofit can provide about a $15,000 to $85,000 savings in the cost to repair. For a wood-sided house, the savings is on average $50,000 to $115,000 in cost to repair. Now, those are averages, and the averages vary by the simulated location of the earthquakes that were under study and the intensity of an earthquake over time. But we found those findings to be robust across earthquakes of this size of significance and in these many different locations in the state. The key message here, the savings from retrofitting can be large and are generally larger in wood-sided homes. For two-story houses, the benefits are even greater, and again, the largest for wood-sided homes. At almost up to from $150,000 to $200,000. For a stucco house, the brace and bolt retrofit can provide about $100,000 to $150,000 in savings. Two-story houses save even more than one-story houses. As you can imagine, with a two-story house, there's more square footage, there's more to damage, there's more to lose, and more to gain from a retrofit. So this diagram is another way of showing repair cost savings from investing in a retrofit. Taking just one earthquake location in Northridge, California, and that is not the 1994 earthquake scenario or data, but a future quake in that location as was simulated in the study. And we have the largest benefits for the wood-sided homes again here, including the largest percent reduction in repair costs of 84% for the one-story wood frame home, and a still largest potential dollar saving for the two-story wood-sided home. The brace and bolt benefit is on average, in terms of repair costs alone, remember, on the order of 60 to 80%. Now here again is the fine print. For many readers, many in this targeted stakeholder audiences, this is too much detail, but we do acknowledge these important underlying assumptions of the study in our stakeholder report. The study simulated repair costs for 4 housing types, essentially in realistic, hypothetical ground shaking levels in 4 locations at risk in California. Researchers chose these housing types because the 2 most important factors in the amount of risk and the amount of benefit that a retrofit can give you are the number of stories in your house and the siding, either wood or stucco. Now, details like the house's actual size, age, location, configuration, the quality and types of the construction materials, the level of maintenance, and of course the intensity of shaking, how far from the event you are, and regional construction market conditions, they're all going to matter. But none of the factors I've just mentioned went against our overall conclusions that retrofits provide significant repair cost savings. So how much does a brace and bolt retrofit cost? That was actually not a part of this study, but in the over 10,000 qualifying retrofits in CEA's brace and bolt program, the average typical cost is around $3,000 to $7,000. It tends to be more expensive in Northern California than in Southern California, but using this value, we can say that the savings in post-earthquake repairs could be 8 to 14 times more than a typical retrofit cost. So that's a pretty good cost benefit for an earthquake with an intensity of about 10% chance of occurring in the next 30 years. It's not easy to portray or understand earthquake probabilities, how they vary over space, over what time period they are referring to, or for a homeowner to hear a number associated with retrofit savings and consider the fact that many different earthquakes can occur or not occur that affect their property over time. Well, in this stakeholder report, we use the Yousef 3 fault movement probability map to help convey how earthquake risk varies over the state and the various locations simulated in the study. Part of the reason to show a map, a very colorful, concrete portrayal of earthquake risk,
Sharyl, you're on mute.
Hi, Sharyl.
Sharyl?
Uh-oh. Hi, Sharyl.
Sharyl, we can't hear you.
Okay, I think we had an audible gremlin in there. So Sharyl, we couldn't hear you around the Yousef 3 map, but in the interest of time, perhaps what we can do is ask you and Evan to open up your mics as well as your video. And I'd like to go into the Q&A portion of our session. And if there's an opportunity, Sharyl, for you to just say something so we know whether or not we can hear you right now, that would be helpful. Okay. I'm not sure Sharyl can hear us either, but let's proceed. We do have a few questions from David Wald to Evan. He's saying, maybe you missed this, but are the modelers using the same exact input shaking values as the peer CEA project, or are they using their own estimates of the 250-year shaking level and the PSHA for annualized losses?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
First, let me just actually say one thing in correction. I want to let you all know that Jasmine and Aaron had uploaded the correct slides. I thought that they had uploaded a wrong slide, but that was my misinterpretation. So thank you to you two for getting that right. I'm sorry, I was thinking it was a different slide. Okay, so David, you make a very good point. We did specify 4 locations, as you see on the slide right here now, San Francisco, Bakersfield, Northridge, and San Bernardino. We provide the lat longs and the soil type to the loss modelers, but only one of them was able to actually cut and paste our hazard curves for those specific sites. The other ones use their own view of the hazard at that site. And there were some differences. And in our Working Group 6 report, we go into that in more detail. So you will see those differences, how much they were. And so that does certainly affect, obviously, making a pure apples to apples comparison between the vulnerability functions. But again, that was sort of part of the sort of semi-blind study that we created in order to protect everybody's IP. Hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. Another question, and maybe we can direct this to several people in our group. So many people have heard the NIBS studies estimate. NIBS is the National Institute of Building Sciences. They released a study not too long ago that, that says for every dollar spent on mitigation, $4 are saved. And this is particular to earthquakes. So how does that very simple message compare with the peer CEA project results? Evan, do you want to get us started on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So I'm very familiar with that that report. I did some editing on the updated version of that, which shows some even better results. And I think Sharyl, Sharyl noted it in one of her last slides there, was that, we see an average return of 8 to 14 times, in a specific event, like a 250-year event, but even amortize over, over the life of the house, that $4 or thereabouts benefit, that 4-to-1 benefit is there. In particular, when you start including some of the other types of recovery costs that NIB study would include, like relocation expenses or sort of lost economic costs and things like that. So yeah, I think this compares quite well with those results.
Yousef?
Well,
Your
that's fine. I
thoughts?
think, Sharyl showed also the same thing. That's fine.
Okay, great. And I'd like to just point out that our scope of work was extremely focused on cripple wall homes. And as has been described, we focused on 1- and 2-story and some different vintages. We'd love to, and Sharyl, I think, summarized the change of the cost of repair for the retrofitted and unretrofitted cases. So this is as distilled as we can get with our cost savings at this point. Okay, let's see. I think that's good for our project overview.
Grace,
yes.
we have one question that just came in.
Okay, go ahead. Or would you? Yeah.
How about I read it?
Yeah.
How wide did you pick the 4 locations for the basis of your analysis? How does the seismicity in these areas compare with the retrofit design criteria of the P1100 guidelines?
Who wants to, should I answer that? Should I give it a shot? And then maybe you, or Yousef, do you want to start?
The starting point is that, in fact, you are going to hear this afternoon by Silvia Mazzoni. We selected 10 sites across the state of California. And then we compared the seismicity. We found out that we don't have to really analyze all 10 sites. If we select those 4, we are covering rest of the state basically in terms of various seismicity. Then, Evan, you want to continue on that?
And I believe one of the 4 sites, it was either the San Bernardino or the Northridge site, I believe. When you look at the P1100, ATC 110, seismicity / retrofit requirements, one of those 2 sites was sort of at the extreme end of that, meaning you still had a specific retrofit, but the seismicity was sort of on the high end of the range that would be used for that type of retrofit. So I think we sort of added that one in, after we had come up with 3 initial sites, thinking to ourselves, let's see what one site looks like in terms of retrofit when it's sort of on a high seismicity, but not high enough to bump it up into a whole nother type of retrofit.
Okay.
Oh, Sharyl is online.
All right. Janelle, were there any other questions then?
No further questions, Grace.
Okay. At this point then, let's see. We'd like to thank everyone for your attention and your questions. And at this point, I'd like to ask Janelle to take us out to lunch.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Yousef, Grace, Evan, and Sharyl. And I have to tell you all, if you had a chance to catch Sharyl give the entire presentation, it's really phenomenal, the amount of information that we're going to be able to use. I think, as you listen to Evan and Sharyl summarize, they've done a great job of putting it into straight, plain English, we'll call it. But it is a difficult message. As they said, different configurations, different locations, different size of earthquake. And so the idea is we're trying to create from that a message that is very easy to convey to people, to let them know just exactly how important this retrofit is. So thank you so much for that great introduction. And we're going to start our lunch a little bit early, which is fantastic. So we are going to reconvene exactly at 1:30, and we'll be back with more details about the PEER project. Thank you so much. Enjoy your lunch.